Hey guys, tonight we wander back more than 4,000 years to a landscape of sun-baked mud-brick cities, dusty fields where oxen plodded in slow circles, and a river valley where people were still figuring out how to live together without constantly knocking down each other's walls. You are about to meet Ur-Nammu, a man who thought he could turn chaos into order. You probably won't survive this ancient bureaucracy, but don't worry. It's going to lull you into sleep long before you re-asked to count a shipment of barley. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing the little constellation of viewers across the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story opens in Mesopotamia around 2100 BCE, when Sumer looked more like a giant clay chessboard than a united kingdom. Each city had its own walls, its own gods, and its own ambitions. For centuries, kings had risen and fallen in rapid succession. Neighboring Akkad had once ruled with crushing force under Sargon and Naram-Sin, but that empire collapsed, leaving power scattered like broken bricks after a storm. In this power vacuum, smaller warlords squabbled, while farmers just wanted their irrigation canals cleared, so they could grow their barley without someone stealing it. Ur, the southern city by the edge of the marshes, was battered but not broken. It had seen floods, invasions, and famine. Into this mess stepped Ur-Nammu, originally a military governor under another king, Utohegel of Uruk. Historians still argue whether Ur-Nammu betrayed his master outright or simply stepped in when Utohegel drowned in the river. Either way, by around 2112 BCE, Ur-Nammu took the throne of Ur and declared himself king, not just of one city, but of all Sumer. What makes this moment fascinating is the contrast. While so much of Mesopotamia was wrecked by bandits and local chiefs grabbing power, Ur-Nammu insisted on stability. Imagine a tired parent walking into a messy house after a party, the cups overturned, food on the floor, arguments everywhere. Instead of yelling, calmly beginning to put things in neat rows. That's what Ur-Nammu did with his kingdom. To gain legitimacy, he had to convince people that the gods actually wanted him in charge. In Mesopotamian culture, no king ruled without divine backing. Priests were the PR agents of the gods, and temples were not just religious sites, but also banks, granaries, and law offices rolled into one. Ur-Nammu aligned himself especially with Nana, the moon god worshipped in Ur. If the moon shone over Ur, then surely Ur-Nammu was chosen. Clay tablets record him boasting that he restored order, drove away chaos, and reopened temples that had been neglected. But his real genius lay in something subtler. Organization. He didn't rely solely on swords and soldiers, though he had those too. Instead, he structured a system where fields were measured, canals were dredged, and taxes were predictable. People might grumble about taxes, but they would still prefer predictable grumbling over random raids. One mainstream historical fact here is that Ur-Nammu issued one of the earliest known law codes, even predating Hammurabi's more famous stele. The very idea that laws could be written down and applied consistently was revolutionary. At this early stage of his reign, though, he had to secure loyalty from cities that had long been rivals. Lagash, Uruk, Eridor had their own agendas. Ur-Nammu marched with armies to demonstrate strength, but he also negotiated with priests to restore their temple lands. He issued proclamations that people's debts would be reduced, a clever way to win favor among the lower classes, while frustrating the wealthy lenders. If you owed a pile of grain to your neighbor, suddenly finding the king had cancelled or reduced that debt must have felt like a divine blessing. Of course, not everyone trusted him. Fringe tidbits from archaeological finds suggest that in some cities, locals created graffiti-like marks on clay bricks, mocking rulers from your... It's a strange thought that even in 2100 BCE, people were grumbling about politics in their own quiet ways. Historians sometimes debate whether those marks were personal names, worker notations, or genuine complaints, but the possibility of ancient sarcastic bricketchings is almost too human to ignore. From the broader perspective, Ur-Nammu's rise wasn't just about power. It was about timing. The people were exhausted. Decades of war had left irrigation systems clogged with silt. Without water flowing, barley crops failed. And without barley there was no beer, which meant an entire civilization was collectively cranky. By stepping in and cleaning canals, organizing labor crews, and ensuring surplus grain reached the temples, Ur-Nammu gained both divine approval and popular gratitude. The wider Mesopotamian world noticed. To the east, in Elam, rulers watched warily. To the north, remnants of Akkadian lords muttered. But for now, the south pulled together. A sense of restoration spread. Songs and hymns recorded by scribes paint Ur-Nammu as a shepherd, a classic Mesopotamian image of kingship. He was the shepherd who guided his people, not just the warrior who crushed them. There's a quiet irony here. The same clay that crumbled empires also preserved their stories. Tablets etched with wedge-shaped cuneiform strokes carry Ur-Nammu's words across millennia. Some fragments tell us about his building works, others about his laws. Even more tantalizing are those broken lines that hint at lost tales. Historians still argue whether Ur-Nammu composed personal hymns or whether scribes just attributed them to him to flatter his court. Either way, the name survived, and as the first year of his reign gave way to the second, Ur-Nammu began the slow, careful process of reorganizing a kingdom. He had emerged from chaos, but surviving was only the beginning. Could he maintain order? Or would the endless cycle of Mesopotamian collapse repeat once more? The answer lay in the clay tablets, the canals, the temples, and the soldiers standing guard along mud-brick walls. Step by step, Ur-Nammu was about to transform a scattered land into something resembling a state. The crown was not enough. Anyone could seize a throne with soldiers at their back, but keeping it meant weaving legitimacy into every corner of life. Ur-Nammu understood that crowns were fragile things, more fragile than baked clay tablets, which at least could last for millennia in the dirt. His first priority was to make people believe he wasn't just a lucky usurper who stepped in after Utuhigel's unfortunate swimming accident. He needed to become something deeper, a ruler chosen by the gods and written into the fabric of Sumer itself. In Mesopotamia, myths and rituals were political tools. If the moon god Nana approved of Ur-Nammu, then scribes had to write it, priests had to chant it, and festivals had to prove it. One hymn from this era describes the king as beloved of Nana, chosen in the lap of Ningal, a poetic way of saying he was basically hand-picked by divine parents. To reinforce this image, Ur-Nammu poured resources into temple restoration. Temples weren't just sacred, they were civic centers, storage houses, and tax offices. Rebuilding them sent a clear message. The gods were happy again, and so were their accountants. At court, rituals played out with carefully staged theater. The king would sit on a habacked chair, wearing a fringed robe, while priests burned incense and recited lines older than memory. A seal impression shows him clasping a staff, a shepherd's symbol, as if to remind everyone that he guided the flock. This wasn't random costume plate, it was branding. Just as modern leaders pose with flags or photo ops, Ur-Nammu posed with divine symbols pressed into clay. Every seal that rolled across wet tablets spread his name, his title, and his cosmic legitimacy. Of course, legitimacy also lived in the bureaucracy. Clay tablets weren't glamorous, but they were the nervous system of the state. They recorded which farmer owed barley, which temple was allotted goats, and which canal section needed dredging. Ur-Nammu expanded the use of these records, standardizing the system so that every official transaction left a mark in cuneiform. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a database upgrade. More consistent entries, fewer loopholes for crooked administrators. Historians still argue whether Ur-Nammu himself devised these reforms, or whether clever scribes simply attached his name to long-standing practices. After all, rulers liked to take credit for systems that scribes had been managing for generations. But the evidence suggests he at least pushed for broader organization. One mainstream historical fact is that under Ur-Nammu and his dynasty, scribal schools flourished, teaching not just writing, but also accounting, mathematics, and even early geometry. The ability to measure fields, calculate rations, and tabulate taxes wasn't just scholarly plate, was the lifeblood of his administration. And while officials busied themselves scratching wedge marks into damp clay, ordinary people saw more tangible changes. Rituals became more grand, festivals more orderly, and proclamations more predictable. A fringe tidbit here. One fragment suggests Ur-Nammu may have sponsored public recitations of his building projects, essentially having poets brag on his behalf in marketplaces. Imagine shopping for dates and barley while a herald declaims. Hear how Ur-Nammu rebuilt the temple of Nana, brick by brick. It was a mix of advertising and spiritual reassurance. Still, every proclamation needed teeth. That's where rituals intersected with real power. If a governor or priest ignored the king's orders, He risked not just royal wrath, but also divine disfavor. Temples depended on royal support for repairs and offerings, so priests had strong incentives to cooperate. Ur-Nammu was threading the needle between control and partnership, strong enough to command, flexible enough to share prestige. It helped that he presented himself as a builder king. Mesopotamian culture loved rulers who left visible monuments, and Ur-Nammu leaned into this tradition. His inscriptions stress not military conquests, but temple restoration and city organization, unlike Naram-Sin of Akut, who carved images of himself trampling enemies like a demigod. Ur-Nammu chose a softer persona, the shepherd who builds, the father who provides. In a land weary of warlords, that image was soothing. The rituals surrounding his coronation echoed this theme. Scribes described him as the one who establishes justice in the land, tying him directly to order itself. It's easy to dismiss this as propaganda, but imagine hearing it as a farmer whose debts had just been forgiven, or as a merchant whose caravan was now safer on the roads. Propaganda feels different when it matches lived experience. One quirky aspect of his reign is the emphasis on standardized weights and measures. Clay cones and tablets show evidence of official standards for barley measures and shekel weights. Scholars debate whether this was Ur-Nammu's personal initiative or a broader Ur-3 dynasty policy. But either way, it made daily life more predictable. Picture weighing out silver dust on a balanced scale and knowing it actually meant the same from city to city. That's a kind of quiet revolution, even if it doesn't sound glamorous. The deeper Ur-Nammu entrenched himself in ritual and bureaucracy, the less anyone could question his place. People might not love taxes, but they came to expect them. Priests might grumble about sharing power, but temples thrived under royal patronage. Even enemies had to acknowledge his growing legitimacy. The crown alone could never have held it all together. But the combination of clay tablets, myths, seals, and rituals wove a net around his rule. By the time scribes etched his proclamations, the message was clear. Ur-Nammu wasn't a placeholder. He was the king who measured, recorded, and sanctified every detail of Sumerian life. And beneath that calm order lay the foundations for his next move. Not just controlling symbols and rituals, but literally measuring the land itself. If he could survey fields, map canals, and tie the geography to his authority, then the kingdom would not only recognize him, it would depend on him. To control people, you had to control the ground beneath their feet. Ur-Nammu realized this early on. The canals, fields, and orchards of Sumer were the true veins of power. Whoever measured them, assigned them, and taxed them effectively owned the kingdom. Soldiers could only enforce rules for so long. The deeper authority came from mapping the landscape and making it legible to the throne. Imagine surveyors trudging out under the burning Mesopotamian sun, carrying ropes knotted at standard lengths, wooden rods, and clay tablets balanced carefully in baskets. They marked boundaries with stones or clay pegs, then scratched notes into wet tablets about how much barley a plot could yield. This wasn't just about farming, it was about defining order. Fields without records led to arguments, and arguments led to blood feuds. By laying down official surveys, Ur-Nammu reduced disputes and quietly tied every patch of earth to his name. Historians still argue whether these surveys were centralized innovations of Ur-Nammu or extensions of older practices revived after decades of chaos. The consensus leans toward continuity, but with his reign amplifying the scale, a mainstream fact. Under the Ur-III dynasty, administrative tablets exploded in number, with archives from cities like Umma and Drehem showing massive bureaucratic reach. These weren't rare or symbolic. They were everyday tools, logging everything from plow teams to sacrificial sheep. The canals were perhaps more important than the fields themselves. Without proper dredging, the Tigris and Euphrates turned farmland into marsh or desert. Ur-Nammu sent crews to clear silt, dig feeder channels, and repair embankments. One hymn boasts that he made the waters flow in harmony. Behind the poetic flair was sheer hard labor. Men knee-deep in mud, dragging baskets of wet earth, overseen by officials ticking names off on tablets. A fringe tidbit here. Some tablets preserve lists of workers who skipped canal duty, fined with deductions in their rations of barley and beer. Even in 2100 BCE, people were finding excuses to dodge public works projects. Measuring land also tied into taxation. Once you knew how much a plot could yield, you could demand predictable quotas. Farmers delivered barley, wool, fish, or dates, all tallied by scribes. The king's agents then redistributed these good stemples, received offerings, soldiers received rations, and workers were paid in standardized amounts. By controlling the flow from field to storehouse, Ur-Nammu didn't just tax the land, he owned the rhythm of life. But the surveys weren't purely practical. They carried symbolic weight to assigning land meant assigning identity. When officials planted clay boundary stones, often inscribed with curses against anyone who moved them, they weren't just marking property, they were stamping royal authority into the soil itself. May the gods strike down whoever shifts this marker, the inscriptions threatened. It's one thing to argue with your neighbor about a row of date palms. It's another to argue with Nana, the moon god, who now supposedly policed the boundary. At the same time, the land surveys offered opportunities for patronage. Loyal officials received estates, temple administrators gained endowments, and ordinary farmers found some of their debts remitted. Ur-Nammu positioned himself as the shepherd who made sure everyone had their proper sherivan, if that share ultimately kept them dependent on the state. There's also a human texture here. Picture a farmer watching surveyors pace across his field, stretching ropes and jotting figures. He might grumble, but part of him probably felt relief. At least now the yield was defined, the tax predictable, and the neighbor's claims limited. In a land long racked by chaos, predictability felt like a blessing, even if it meant surrendering to bureaucracy. One scholarly debate lingers over whether Ur-Nammu's surveys extended into detailed cadastral maps, with real drawings of fields, or whether records stayed in list form. The tantalizing thing is that fragments of what look like simple diagrams have been found in later Mesopotamian archives. Were these prototypes already alive under Ur-Nammu? We can't be sure. Historians still argue whether those broken lines in clay were doodles, math exercises, or protomaps of the land itself. What we do know is that the system worked. The kingdom of Ur didn't collapse overnight, as so many Mesopotamian states had before. For decades, it functioned like a great clay machine. Fields measured, canals dredged, taxes collected, temples endowed. And at the heart of it all was the idea that the king had not only conquered, but organized the land. One quirky fringe tidbit. In some surviving tablets, surveyors noted the presence of unusual features, like an old tree of Inanna marking a boundary, or even a place of crocodiles. It's a reminder that land wasn't abstract grids, but living terrain, filled with sacred groves, dangerous animals, and local stories. Those little notations show us that even the driest bureaucrats noticed the quirks of reality. By tying the kingdom's identity to measurement, Ur-Nammu transformed mud and reeds into an ordered cosmos. His subjects walked furrows carved by oxen, drew water from canals, and delivered sacks of barley to granaries, all according to schedules that the crown controlled. The act of measuring wasn't just arithmetic, it was kingship itself. And once the land was measured and the canals flowing, Ur-Nammu could turn to the next pillar of his rule, counting what flowed across those lands. Grain, sheep, and fish didn't just feed people. They filled ledgers, paid soldiers, and sustained temples. The kingdom ran not only on clay and canals, but on the endless tallies of barley and sheep that scribes dutifully recorded. Grain was power. Sheep were wealth. In Ur-Nammu's world, the pulse of the kingdom was measured not by coins, clinking in purses, but by sacks of barley stacked in storehouses, and herds bleating in reed pens. To organize a realm meant counting every sheaf and hoof, then making sure they moved through the right hands. Without this system of tallies and quotas, the kingdom would crumble like a mud-brick wall in the rain. Picture a scribe in Ummah or Driham, sitting cross-legged, stylus in hand, leaning over a damp clay tablet. He presses careful wedges to record. So-and-so delivered 30 gur of barley. So-and-so failed to deliver his quota of sheep. These tablets filled archives that archaeologists later unearthed by the thousands. It's one mainstream fact. The Ur III dynasty left behind more than 30,000 administrative tablets, making it one of the best documented bureaucracies of the ancient world. You'd think this was overkill, but to Ur-Nammu, more tablets meant more control. Taxes weren't abstract. They came in real, heavy form. Barley was the lifeblood boiled into porridge, baked into bread, fermented into beer. Sheep provided wool for clothing and milk for dairy. Fish, dates, and reeds also entered the system, but barley and sheep dominated. Each household owed a portion, determined by those land surveys we just walked through. Deliveries were scheduled seasonally, and penalties for missing them were steep. If you failed, you might lose land, labor rights, or face public shame etched forever into clay. Yet, Ur-Nammu wasn't simply squeezing his people dry. He structured taxation so that redistribution kept society functioning. Barley collected from farmers fed the army. Sheep taken from herders supplied temples with offerings. Rations were doled out to workers who dredged canals or carried bricks for temple walls. It was less like a cash tax and more like an enormous conveyor belt of food and goods that sustained every part of the kingdom. Historians still argue whether this redistribution was fair or crushing. Some see it as proto-socialism, a central system feeding soldiers, priests, and laborers. Others view it as oppressive extraction, forcing peasants into endless toil for the state. The truth is probably both. If your delivery was modest and predictable, the system felt stabilizing. But if floods ruined your crop, taxes still demanded their due, and suddenly your household fell into debt slavery. A quirky tidbit hides in the rations. Many tablets record specific beer allotments, sometimes 3 liters a day for workers, sometimes more for supervisors. Beer wasn't just a treat. It was the safe way to drink water and a staple of nutrition. Imagine trudging through the sun with a clay ration token promising you not only food, but also a daily jug of beer. It's a reminder that bureaucracy, in its own way, kept people slightly tipsy as it kept them in line. The counting of sheep was no less meticulous. Herding communities drove flocks to state pens, where officials counted them by tapping tally sticks or calling out numbers to scribes. Special attention was paid to lambs, since flocks were taxed not just by size but by expected growth. One surviving tablet even records fines against herders for losing sheep to wolves. Bureaucracy, after all, didn't care about excuses, it only cared about numbers. And those numbers rippled upward. Governors reported quotas to the palace. Temples recorded offerings with the same obsessive detail. Soon, a vast river of grain and wool flowed through the system, all of it tied back to Ur-Nammu's administration. The palace of Ur became a kind of giant stomach, swallowing resources from every corner of the land, and then spitting them back out as wages, feasts, and construction projects. But for ordinary people, the system had a different face. Imagine carrying a sack of barley to the temple storehouse, waiting as an official checked it against the quota. Your hands ached, your feet hurt, and you probably muttered under your breath. But once the tablet was marked and the debt recorded, you could go home knowing your obligations were settled at least until the next season. Predictability was its own reward in a world where chaos had once ruled. One scholarly debate lingers on whether taxation was primarily for redistribution or for temple endowment. Did Ur-Nammu centralize everything into royal hands, or did he mostly channel goods to priests? Evidence leans toward a mixed model. Temples received huge shares, but were themselves enmeshed in the royal system. They were less independent than in earlier centuries, more like branches of the state. This blend of sacred and bureaucratic blurred the line between giving to gods and giving to the king. The brilliance of this setup was that everyone could claim to be serving the divine order. Priests said offerings pleased the gods. Officials said quotas strengthened the kingdom. Farmers said, well, At least the beer ration was decent. And through it all, Ur-Nammu's authority became as natural as the irrigation cycles themselves. Still, the system wasn't perfect. Famines struck, bandits raided, and records sometimes show panicked adjustments. One fragment even preserves an account of missing donkeys, which seems trivial until you realize donkeys were the delivery trucks of the Bronze Age. Without them, grain couldn't move, soldiers couldn't march, and suddenly the whole machine jammed. A lost donkey was more than bad luck. It was a logistical crisis. By embedding his rule into tallies of barley and sheep, Ur-Nammu built a kingdom that didn't just fight wars or build temples. It accounted for everything. People lived inside a world of quotas and rations, a world where clay tablets defined reality. And in that ordered world, the king's hand stretched quietly into every household. But taxation and tallies were only one side of stability. To keep this system humming, Ur-Nammu needed allies in the spiritual realm. Priests, temples, and rituals weren't optional. They were the glue that kept divine favor and political authority bound together. Which meant his next great bargain wasn't with farmers or herders, but with the gods themselves. If barley and sheep were the veins of the kingdom, then temples were the heart-pumping wealth, belief, and legitimacy through every city. Ur-Nammu understood that without the gods on his side, no amount of surveys or quotas could keep Sumer glued together. People didn't just want a king. They wanted a king chosen by divine will. And that meant striking a careful bargain with the priests, who spoke for the gods and guarded their monumental houses of brick. When Ur-Nammu took power, many temples had been neglected. The chaos after the fall of Akkad left sanctuaries cracked, altars empty, and offerings sporadic at best. To ordinary people, this wasn't just a matter of crumbling architecture, was terrifying. If temples decayed, the gods themselves were thought to turn their backs on the land. Floods, plagues, and invasions could all be interpreted as divine punishment. By restoring temples, Ur-Nammu wasn't just renovating buildings. He was repairing the relationship between heaven and earth. One of his boldest projects was the great ziggurat of Ur, a terraced mountain of baked brick that soared above the flat plain. It was dedicated to Nanna, the moon god, patron of Ur. Imagine the sight. Workers hauling mud bricks up ramps, priests sprinkling holy water over each foundation, the slow rise of a man-made mountain where none should exist. When complete, it dominated the skyline. Farmers trudging home from the fields could look up and see the staircase of heaven shimmering in moonlight, a literal ladder tying their king to the divine. But temples weren't only symbols, they were banks and granaries. Priests managed offerings, loans, and land leases. If Ur-Nammu wanted stability, he had to share power with them. This is where the bargain came in. He gave them resources, labor, and prestige, and in return they preached his divine mandate. Clay inscriptions make this relationship plain. Ur-Nammu, beloved of Nanna, who built the temple with pure hands. It's both bragging rights and a receipt for services rendered. Historians still argue whether this arrangement was a genuine partnership or a subtle power grab. Some scholars see Ur-Nammu as strengthening the temples to decentralize authority. Let the gods take the blame for harsh policies. Others suggest he deliberately tied temples closer to the crown, so priests couldn't act independently. Both interpretations hold truth, and the surviving tablets don't settle the matter. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens experienced this bargain through festivals. Ur-Nammu sponsored grand processions where statues of gods were paraded through the streets, accompanied by music, incense, and free rations. These weren't just religious events, they were PR campaigns. The king appeared alongside divine statues, walking in rhythm with drums, the smell of roasting meat thick in the air. For one day, the kingdom's hierarchy was visible and reassuring. The gods above, the king chosen by them, and the people fed and entertained below. A fringe tidbit makes this even more vivid. In one hymn, Ur-Nammu boasts that he provided not only sacrifices for the gods, but also sweet beer in abundance for the people. That's right, the divine bargain came with free drinks. If you've ever wondered how rulers kept popularity in a pre-voting world, the answer is beer festivals blessed by moonlight. The temples also became centers of employment. Bricklayers, carpenters, weavers, brewers found steady work through temple projects. By channeling taxes into construction, Ur-Nammu created jobs and reinforced loyalty. Each brick laid in a ziggurat was both a prayer and a paycheck. One mainstream fact here: some of the best preserved administrative archives come from temple complexes like Drehan, where livestock movements were logged with precision. These records weren't spiritual. They were spreadsheets in clay. Yet beneath the surface, tensions always simmered. Priests wielded enormous influence, and Ur-Nammu had to make sure their loyalty didn't eclipse his own. That's why he paired religious patronage with law codes, military presence, and taxation. If a priest grumbled, he still depended on the crown for building funds and workers. It was a balancing act, less church and state, and more church as semi-autonomous branch office of the palace. The people, though, likely didn't see this nuance. They saw a king who built temples, restored rituals, and poured offerings onto altars. They saw priests praising his name, festivals showering them with food and drink, and sacred processions tying the community together. To them, Ur-Nammu was more than a political ruler. He was the human face of divine favor. One quirky, scholarly debate centers on whether Ur-Nammu himself ever acted as a priest-king in rituals, like earlier rulers had. Some inscriptions hint at him performing sacrifices personally, while others show priests taking the lead. Historians still argue whether these were symbolic appearances or genuine priestly duties. The uncertainty makes the image even more intriguing. Was Ur-Nammu swinging censers of incense in sacred halls? Or was he happy to delegate while keeping his robe free of goat blood? What matters is that the bargain worked. With temples restored, priests satisfied, and gods visibly honored, Ur-Nammu cemented his rule in the realm of belief. His authority wasn't just enforced by soldiers or scribes. It was sanctified by divine architecture rising above the plains. And once the gods were firmly on his side. He could turn his attention to the other tool of kingship, an army to keep both neighbors and restless subjects in check. The quiet hum of scribes and the chanting of priests could only carry a kingdom so far. Behind all the rituals and tallies stood another pillar of power. Soldiers in copper helmets, shields on their backs, spears in their hands. Ur-Nammu knew that a kingdom of clay walls and irrigation canals needed protection. And protection meant a standing army, drilled and organized to keep both foreign enemies and internal rebels in check. Picture the streets of Ur as soldiers assembled. The clink of copper helmets echoed as they formed in lines, shields strapped across their chests, leather tunics stiff with sweat. These weren't ragtag levies summoned only in times of war. Under Ur-Nammu, military service became a structured duty, tied into the same bureaucracy that measured barley and sheep. Men were registered, their rations carefully recorded on clay tablets, and their units organized into formations resembling early battalions. Historians still argue whether Ur-Nammu's forces were primarily citizen militias or included a professional corps supported full-time by rations. Surviving records suggest both. Some soldiers farmed land in peacetime and marched in war, while others were retained continuously for guard duty and border patrols. Either way, the result was a standing force that gave the kingdom an edge over less organized rivals. A mainstream historical fact helps anchor this. Evidence from tablets at Ur-Nammu shows vast rations of barley and wool allocated to Gurush workers and soldiers alike, meaning the state had a permanent provisioning system. Feeding an army was as important as training it, and the endless flow of grain ensured that spears stayed sharp and shields stayed manned. The army's duties weren't just about conquest. They guarded canals from sabotage, kept roads clear of bandits, and patrolled the fringes of marshland where rebels might hide. Ur-Nammu also stationed garrisons in strategic cities, making sure governors remained loyal. Soldiers were as much political insurance as military defense. The copper helmets weren't just for war, they were for the steady, watchful presence that kept order day by day. Weapons themselves reflected the balance of old and new. Spears and axes dominated, with bows supplementing in skirmishes. Copper helmets and bronze-edged blades glinted in the sun. Shields were large, often rectangular, giving phalanx-like formations stability. Archaeological finds suggest some units may have used chariots pulled by onagers, wild donkey hybrids. A fringe tidbit here. Records mention the training and feeding of these onagers, creatures notoriously bad-tempered compared to horses. Managing them required skill, and scribes logged their fodder almost as carefully as soldiers' rations. But military strength wasn't just about equipment, it was about morale. To tie soldiers' loyalty to him, Ur-Nammu paid them with food, beer, and cloth directly from palace stores. Service was rewarded not in coin, but in survival goods, a system that bound their bellies to the throne. Many soldiers also received land allotments, further tying them to the stability of the kingdom. If the king fell, Their rations and fields vanished with him. Still, war was never far away. The neighboring land of Elam to the east eyed Sumer with suspicion. Northern remnants of Akkad watched for weakness, and within the south, old city rivalries simmered, waiting for any excuse to flare up. Ur-Nammu deployed his forces strategically, quelling resistance and reminding both friends and enemies that Ur was no soft target. His inscriptions boast of victories, though, as always, propaganda probably inflated them. One scholarly debate lingers over how large his army really was. Some argue tens of thousands, citing massive ration allocations. Others suggest only a few thousand permanent troops, supplemented by seasonal levies. The truth likely lies in between, with numbers swelling in campaigns and shrinking in quieter years. Regardless, the sight of soldiers patrolling walls, helmets glinting under the Mesopotamian sun, sent a clear message. Order here was enforced not just by tablets and temples, but by steel and discipline. Soldiers also became part of the king's public image. In festivals, units marched in formation, displaying shields and spears as crowds cheered. The rituals of power blended with military theater, reminding everyone that the gods approved not only of Ur-Nammu's justice, but also of his armies. It was one thing to see the king leading processions with priests. It was another to see him flanked by armored men, banners fluttering, drums pounding like heartbeats through the streets. And just as with temples, the army doubled as an employment system. Young men found work, rations, and identity in the ranks. Training molded them into disciplined units, and loyalty to their officers often meant loyalty to the crown. Some tablets even record disciplinary measures, deductions in rations for absent soldiers, fines for negligence. Military service wasn't just glory, it was paperwork and quotas, as dull and relentless as farming, only with sharper stakes. A quirky tidbit to soften the edges. Records mention beer rations for soldiers too, carefully measured by volume. One scribe tallied so many liters for the guard of the gate. Imagine being the weary night watchman, leaning on a spear, sipping your allotted jug of beer as the moon climbed over the ziggurat. For all the grand imagery of armies, much of soldiering was boredom and barley beer. By binding military organization into the same clay and quota system that managed farms and temples, Ur-Nammu ensured his soldiers weren't a rogue force, but part of the kingdom's machinery. Their helmets glinted not just with copper, but with bureaucracy. Their shields backed not only by bronze, but by ledgers, and with army and temple both aligned. Ur-Nammu now turned to one of his most radical achievements, carving laws into clay, giving shape to justice itself. For centuries, justice in Sumer had been a messy affair. Disputes were settled by elders, priests, or local strongmen, and the outcome depended less on fairness than on who had more influence. Ur-Nammu saw the danger in this chaos. If canals and barley could be measured, why not disputes? If taxes could be standardized, why not punishments? His answer was one of history's first known law. Codes clay promise that order applied not just to fields and soldiers, but to people's lives. Imagine a judge in your before the code. Two farmers stand before him, arguing over a boundary or a stolen goat. The judge listens, shrugs, and issues a ruling that may or may not satisfy either side. The next day, the same judge might rule completely differently in a similar case. Justice was flexible, which really meant unstable. Ur-Nammu decided to change that. Historians still argue whether Ur-Nammu personally drafted his laws, or whether scribes systematized existing customs in his name. Either way, the result was revolutionary, a written code, inscribed on tablets, that tried to set consistent standards. Unlike later codes carved in grand stone stelas, Ur-Nammu's has survived only in fragments. But those fragments are enough to glimpse his vision of justice. One mainstream historical fact: the surviving laws of Ur-Nammu predate Hammurabi's famous code by about 3 centuries, making them the earliest known written legal system in Mesopotamia, and they're surprisingly humane by ancient standards. Many crimes that Hammurabi punished with death were in Ur-Nammu's code resolved with fines. If someone injured another, the penalty might be a specific weight of silver rather than a beheading. It wasn't equality. Of course, the code differentiated between social classes, but it was at least structured. Picture a tablet etched with wedge-shaped laws. If a man commits murder, that man shall be killed. If a man commits robbery, he shall be put to death. If a man commits an assault on another man, he shall weigh and deliver half a mina of silver. These lines weren't abstract, they were rules that judges could point to, cutting through argument with the authority of written clay. The idea of clay justice rippled outward. Citizens began to understand that disputes could be resolved predictably. If your neighbor damaged your irrigation canal, you didn't need to bribe a priest. You could point to the code and demand compensation. For the first time, people felt that justice was something beyond personal influence, something tied to the king himself. Ur-Nammu became not just a ruler, but the embodiment of fairness. A fringe tidbit here. One surviving fragment suggests punishments for false accusations, showing that even lying in court had its consequences. This detail hints at a society deeply concerned with truth in testimony, because if the clay records were corrupted by lies, the whole system would collapse. Ancient scribes may not have invented lie detectors, but they certainly invented the principle of punishing liars. But the code wasn't only about criminal cases. It also addressed contracts, marriage, and property. For example, if a man divorced his wife, he had to pay compensation in silver. If a slave married a free woman, their children were free. These laws reveal not just rules, but glimpses of daily life. Households, marriages, markets, and all the quiet transactions that made society run. One scholarly debate lingers on whether Ur-Nammu's code was widely applied or mostly symbolic, a royal statement, more than a practical tool. Some argue judges may have continued ruling as before, using the code selectively. Others believe it genuinely reshaped legal practice, spreading consistency across cities. Either way, the symbolism was powerful. Justice itself had been carved into clay. no longer just a matter of whim. To ordinary people, this must have been a strange comfort. Imagine standing in court, nervous and unsure, while a judge cites a line etched by royal decree. It must have felt like the king himself was present, speaking through the tablet. Ur-Nammu's presence extended beyond soldiers and priests into every quarrel and every contract. The very existence of the code also reinforced his image as a builder not only of temples and canals, but of society itself. Just as he laid bricks for ziggurats, he laid rules for human behavior. The metaphor was clear. He was the mason of justice, stacking laws into an edifice as sturdy as any temple wall. Of course, the code didn't erase inequality. Nobles paid smaller fines, slaves harsher ones. Women's rights were limited, though not absent. The code reflected its society, hierarchical, patriarchal, and deeply tied to economic obligations. Yet, within those limits, it carved out something extraordinary, a predictable framework. And here, a quirky tidbit to end on. Fragments of later copies show scribal students practicing the laws centuries after Ur-Nammu's reign, turning them into classroom exercises. Imagine a bored apprentice, stylus in hand, copying out, "If a man, then he shall," over and over, just as students today copy equations. That monotony, that discipline, carried Ur-Nammu's voice across time. With his laws etched in clay and his authority stamped into daily disputes, Ur-Nammu had given his kingdom not only order but permanence. And yet, the laws weren't abstract. They lived in real streets, among real people. To understand how this justice played out, we have to step into the bustling lanes of Ur itself, where merchants, artisans, and families lived under the shadow of ziggurats and the watch of soldiers. Walk with me through the streets of Ur, where the law codes and tax quotas we talked about come alive in the dust and chatter of daily life. The city was a living organism, pulsing with merchants haggling, artisans hammering, and children darting between mud-brick houses. To outsiders, Ur looked like an expanse of brown walls rising out of the floodplain. But inside, its streets buzzed with human detail, predictable, messy, and deeply ordinary. The houses were mostly made of sun-dried mud brick, simple rectangles with a central courtyard. From the street, you'd see plain walls with little more than a wooden door and tiny windows set high for privacy. Inside, families gathered around hearths, with bread ovens puffing smoke and mats spread out for meals. Furniture was minimal: stools, red baskets, clay jars, but life filled every corner. Women spun wool into thread. Children played with clay toys. Archaeologists have found miniature carts and animals, and men returned from fields or workshops with dust in their hair and barley on their minds. Markets were the city's heartbeats. Along open plazas and narrow lanes, stalls sold fish fresh from canals, dates sticky with sweetness, and pottery glinting in the sun. Merchants called out prices while scribes hovered, ready to record larger transactions. A mainstream historical fact: silver by weight was the medium for bigger deals, measured against standardized shekel weights. But for most people, barter ruled traded for grain, beer for reeds, fish for salt. Imagine the air thick with smells, roasting fish, baked bread, and, less pleasantly, donkeys who doubled as delivery trucks. Historians still argue whether AR's neighborhoods were divided by profession, with potters clustered in one lane and metal workers in another, or whether trades were scattered. Excavations suggest some clustering did happen, since kilns and workshops often stood side by side. Either way, the city's sounds were constant. Hammers striking bronze, potters shaping clay, and the murmur of neighbors gossiping. Religion wove through daily life as seamlessly as barley porridge. At sunrise, families paused to sprinkle offerings at household shrines. In the evening, temple bells echoed across the rooftops, calling attention to rituals at Nunna's cigarette. People lived under the moon's gaze, and festivals brought them into the city's streets in throngs. These festivals weren't abstract pageantry, they were noisy, joyful interruptions to routine. Priests chanted hymns while dancers spun, and officials distributed beer rations. Imagine standing in the crowd, cup in hand, watching a golden statue of the moon god carried past by sweating priests, drums thundering in rhythm. For a brief night, everyone shared the same rhythm of belief. A fringe tidbit comes from excavated graves in your sum, contained board games, like the famous royal game of yore. This wasn't just for king's ordinary families, played it to rolling dice and moving tokens across patterned boards. Picture a weary scribe, after a long day tallying barley, leaning back at home to play around with his children. Even bureaucrats needed hobbies. The streets weren't always clean. Waste piled in corners, and open drains carried runoff from houses to canals. Donkeys clattered by with carts. Dogs scrounged scraps, and goats occasionally wandered into alleys. It wasn't glamorous, but it was life. And amid this, justice from Ur-Nammu's laws was felt. If someone cheated in the market, a judge could be summoned. If a neighbor damaged a wall, compensation was expected. The king's authority lived not just in temples, but in these everyday exchanges. One scholarly debate asks whether literacy extended beyond scribes into the merchant class. Some argue many merchants could at least recognize numbers and signatures on tablets. Others insist literacy remained tightly restricted. Either way, everyone respected the tablet system. Even if you couldn't read it, you knew that a clay record carried authority. It was a kind of magic wedges pressed into clay, had the power to decide debts, confirm sales, and shape futures. Craftsmen were another backbone of city life. Bronze workers forged tools and weapons. Potters churned out endless jars for beer and oil, and weavers filled looms with wool. Women likely dominated textile work, producing garments both for households and for temple workshops. Rations paid in barley kept them spinning day after day. Archaeologists have even found loom weights and spindle whirls in modest homes, proof that industry wasn't confined to palaces. Food was the great unifier. Bread, beer, fish, and dates made up most meals. Families kneaded barley dough into flat loaves, cooked stews of lentils or onions, and sweetened dishes with honey or dates when they could afford it. A quirky tidbit: records show recipes mixing beer into bread dough, creating early leavened loaves with a faintly boozy flavor. Imagine waking up to that smell drifting from an oven. Children grew up in this rhythm, helping in fields, running errands, or training in scribal schools if they were lucky. Play was simple: balls of clay, whistles, and toy animals. Some children likely knew no world beyond these crowded lanes and the looming ziggurat that shadowed the horizon. For them, yours wasn't a kingdom or an empire, it was just home. And above it all, the palace loomed, collecting the barley, issuing decrees, and sending soldiers to patrol. But the strength of Ur-Nammu's rule wasn't just in palaces or laws. It was in these streets, where people bartered, baked, prayed, and played under the steady gaze of the moon god's temples. Soon, though Ur-Nammu would push beyond daily life into projects meant to touch eternity, he would turn mud brick and sweat into monuments that still astonish us, today's ziggurats and temples meant to outlast memory itself. When you walk through the bustling streets of yore, it is impossible to ignore the silhouette that dominates the horizon. A stepped mountain of brick, rising where the flat floodplain should only show reeds and fields. This was the ziggurat, Ur-Nammu's most enduring project, built not for himself but for the gods. If laws carved into clay were meant to organize life, then this tower of mud brick was meant to touch eternity. The great ziggurat of yore was dedicated to Nana, the moon god, patron of the city. At its base, millions of sun-dried bricks formed the bulk, stacked layer after layer, while an outer skin of kill-fired bricks, bound with bitumen, gave it strength. Ramps sloped upward in wide sweeps, guiding processions to higher terraces. At the top stood a shrine said to connect heaven and earth, a dwelling for Nana to descend and receive offerings. Even today, its ruins loom across the plain, a silent monument to Ur-Nammu's ambition. But the ziggurat wasn't built by magic. It rose brick by brick on the backs of workers sweating under the Mesopotamian sun. Picture gangs of laborers carrying baskets of mud, mixing straw and clay with bare feet, stamping and shaping each brick. Supervisors shouted orders while scribes scratched names onto tablets, recording who showed up and how many bricks they carried. A mainstream historical fact. Tablets from your record rations of barley and beer. For these very workers' daily wages measured not in coins, but in calories and drink. Construction was ritual as much as engineering. Priests blessed foundations with offerings of grain, beer, and animal sacrifice. Hymns declared the ziggurat a cosmic bond between gods and men. Ur-Nammu himself boasted in inscriptions that he made the temple as high as a mountain. Whether he actually hauled bricks or simply presided in regal robes is unclear, but his presence sanctified the project. Historians still argue whether ziggurats were primarily religious, administrative, or even astronomical structures. Were they stairways for the gods, platforms for priests, or cosmic calendars marking the heavens? The truth may be a mixture. Temples doubled as storehouses and observatories, serving both sacred ritual and practical governance. What is certain is their impact. To a farmer returning from the fields at dusk, the sight of Nana's ziggurat glowing in the moonlight must have been awe itself. Proof that the gods dwelt among them and that Ur-Nammu was their chosen builder. A fringe tidbit makes the human side more vivid. Archaeologists found clay impressions of workers' shoes near the ziggurat's base simple, worn soles pressed into drying mud. Those imprints, left accidentally, are whispers of the ordinary men and women who carried Ur-Nammu's vision upward. Imagine them trudging home at night, clothes dusted with clay, hands raw, yet knowing they had touched a project destined to outlast their own lives. The ziggurat wasn't alone. Across the kingdom, Ur-Nammu sponsored temple repairs and new sanctuaries. Each project tied local gods to his rule, knitting diverse cities into a shared spiritual political fabric. In Lagash, in Eridu, in Uruk, bricks bore his name. To walk into a temple was to walk into his legacy. The act of building was propaganda, prayer, and policy, all in one. One scholarly debate lingers on how much of the ziggurat we owe to Ur-Nammu himself versus his son, Sholgi, who reigned after him. Some argue Ur-Nammu laid only the foundations, while Sholgi completed the upper terraces. Others suggest Ur-Nammu oversaw much more before his death. The broken inscriptions don't give us certainty, only tantalizing hints. But even if his son added bricks, Ur-Nammu began the mountain. Work on these monuments shaped daily life. Farmers rotated into labor crews during off-season. Artisans crafted specialized tools, and brewers prepared extra beer for ration distribution. Building a ziggurat was not just construction, it was community theater, pulling thousands into the orbit of a divine project. The city became both a workshop and a congregation, every citizen in some way tied to the god's new dwelling. And for all the grandeur, practicality was never far behind. Ziggurats weren't hollow vanity projects. Temples atop them stored offerings, managed records, and coordinated festivals. They were centers of administration, where scribes logged goods and priests scheduled rituals. To call them skyscrapers of faith, ISNT, far off they were the bureaucratic and spiritual high-rises of their time. A quirky tidbit to end on. Some scholars believe that the bricks of ziggurats were stamped with Ur-Nammu's name, not just to mark ownership, but as a magical invocation. Every brick whispered his kingship, reinforcing his presence long after his body would be gone. When archaeologists handle these bricks today, they're still reading his silent brag across 4,000 years. With temples soaring and priests satisfied, Ur-Nammu's authority reached the heavens. But the earth still held dangers. Beyond the kingdom's walls were neighbors who eyed summer's wealth, eager to raid its fields and test its defenses. Ur-Nammu's next challenge was not building upward, but looking outward borders, rivals, and the delicate dance of diplomacy. Ziggurat might have risen like a mountain of brick, but beyond its walls stretched a landscape that was anything but serene. Mesopotamia was a patchwork quilt of rival cities, shifting alliances, and opportunistic neighbors, Ur-Nammu could organize fields, temples, and soldiers within his borders. But if he ignored the threats outside them, his kingdom would unravel like a reed mat left too long in the sun. Neighbors stood at the gates, sometimes with trade caravans, sometimes with spears. To the east lay Elam, perched beyond the Zagros mountain. Elamite raiders had long plagued Sumer, swooping down to snatch goods and drag captives. For centuries, Elam and Sumer shared a bitter rhythm. Raid, retaliate, negotiate, repeat. Ur-Nammu wasn't he, naive he, fortified his borders, and likely dispatched punitive campaigns to remind Elam that Ur had teeth. One mainstream historical fact. Tablets from his reign mention military actions against Elam and the surrounding highlands. Proof that his army wasn't only ceremonial but active on the frontier. To the north, remnants of the Akkadian sphere still stirred. Cities like Assur and the lands along the Middle Tigris hadn't forgotten their imperial past. Though weakened, they could still harass trade routes. Ur-Nammu's strategy here was probably less conquest than diplomacy and show of strength. Sending emissaries with gifts or threats was often cheaper than launching campaigns. After all, keeping the canals dredged was expensive enough. But not all neighbors were enemies. Trade bound Mesopotamia outward like invisible threads. Caravans from the north brought timber and metal, essential in a land where palm trunks were too soft for serious construction. Merchants from Dilmun, the island hub in the Persian Gulf, ferried copper and exotic goods. Even faraway Meluhope, probably the Indus Valley, sent beads, ivory, and precious stones. Historians still argue whether Meluhan merchants visited Ur directly or traded through middlemen, but their goods appear in the archaeological record. Imagine holding a carnelian bead from India while standing in a Sumerian marketplace. That tiny object carried stories from oceans away. Diplomacy wasn't just about goods, it was about prestige. Ur-Nammu hosted envoys, staged feasts, and displayed his building projects as symbols of stability. A king who could feed thousands and raise temples was a king worth treating with respect. A fringe tidbit here. Some tablets suggest diplomatic marriages during the Ur-3 period, alliances sealed with royal daughters. Whether Ur-Nammu himself arranged such unions is debated, but the tradition of tying families together with politics is older than writing itself. The kingdom's borders were not abstract lines, but real, fragile edges. Soldiers patrolled levees, guard posts dotted canals, and watchtowers rose over trade roads. Imagine standing on one of those towers, looking out across endless reeds and desert, waiting for the shimmer of a caravan or the dust cloud of raiders. Both could appear at any moment, and the garrison had to be ready for either a handshake or a spear thrust. And trade, as much as war, kept Ur-Nammu's system alive. The palace granaries filled with barley, but without imported timber, copper, and stones. Temples and armies would grind to a halt. That is the paradox of Mesopotamia. It had fertile soil, but lacked the raw materials to build or arm itself. Trade wasn't luxury, it was survival. One scholarly debate lingers over whether Ur-Nammu deliberately styled himself as a regional hegemon, demanding tribute from neighbors, or whether he remained more focused on internal organization. Some inscriptions boast of victories abroad, but they may be formulaic. Scholars point out that unlike later Assyrian kings, Ur-Nammu didn't depict himself trampling foreign rulers. His focus was less conquest and more order at home. Still, the fact that his kingdom survived in such a volatile region proves his diplomacy worked. For ordinary people, these distant negotiations appeared only as ripples in daily life. New goods in the market, new faces in caravans, or new taxes to fund defense. Imagine a merchant weighing out silver dust for a lump of imported copper, muttering about the high prices, but knowing he needed that copper to keep his workshop running. Every trade deal filtered down to the city's alleys, a quirky tidbit to soften the grandeur. One tablet records delivery of foreign dogs, likely as tribute or exotic gifts. These weren't warhounds, they may have been lapdogs for the palace. Picture Ur-Nammu, king of laws and builder of ziggurats, perhaps watching little foreign dogs scamper through palace courtyards. Even diplomacy had its playful side. Through a mix of trade, treaties, marriages, and force, Ur-Nammu kept his neighbors at bay and his borders secure. His kingdom wasn't a fortress sealed off from the world. It was a crossroads humming with exchange. Every shipment of copper, every convoy of timber, every diplomat sipping beer at a feast was part of the machinery that kept Sumer stable. And those feasts, those grand spectacles of food, drink, and music weren't only about diplomacy. Within his own kingdom, they became tools to unify people, reward loyalty, and project abundance. The next step in Ur-Nammu's order wasn't written in clay or carved in bricks. It was brewed in vats and served in mugs of barley beer, under the glow of moonlight. If tablets and soldiers gave Ur-Nammu authority, then banquets and beer gave him popularity. Nothing stitched a kingdom together quite like shared food and drink. In a land where most meals were modest barley bread, onion stew, maybe a fish if you were lucky, the chance to feast at the king's expense was both luxury and propaganda. Ur-Nammu understood this well. Politics wasn't only law, codes, and temples. It was also mugs of frothy beer handed out beneath banners, drums, and laughter. Picture the palace courtyard at night. Torches sputter, shadows stretch across mud-brick walls, and tables sag beneath heaps of roasted lamb, dates dripping with syrup, and baskets of steaming bread. Priests chant blessings while musicians pluck lyres and tap frame drums. Then the beer arrives earthen jars, foaming with the thick, cloudy drink that sustained Sumer officials. Sip politely. Soldiers gulp loudly, and farmers grin as they tilt long straws into communal pots. For one night, everyone is part of the same flock, shepherded by their king. A mainstream historical fact anchors this. Ration tablets from the Ur-3 period record massive distributions of beer, sometimes thousands of liters allocated for workers, festivals, or temple events. These weren't private luxuries, they were systemic, organized celebrations woven into the economy. Ur-Nammu used them to feed labor crews, reward soldiers, and turn festivals into spectacles of abundance. Historians still argue whether these feasts were primarily religious offerings or political theater. In practice, they were both. A festival for Nana meant sacrifices at the ziggurat, but it also meant ordinary citizens left with full bellies and a warm buzz. The line between worship and public relations blurred as seamlessly as beer poured from jar to mug. Rations were another daily reminder of the king's generosity. Workers dredging canals or stacking bricks at the ziggurat received measured allotments of barley, oil, and beer. Tablets list these rations with exhausting precision. So many liters for the overseer, so many for the brick carrier. To us, it looks like bureaucracy. To them, it was survival. Imagine trudging home with your barley tokens, exchanging them for food to feed your family. Every meal tied your household to the palace. A fringe tidbit makes the rations feel oddly modern. One tablet records extra beer for workers during hot months, essentially a seasonal bonus. Think of it as ancient hazard pay, or maybe just a nod to the fact that sweating in the Mesopotamian sun deserved more than dry bread. These small touches helped bind workers to the system, softening the grind with reward. Feasting also served diplomacy inside the kingdom. Governors and priests gathered at the king's table, their loyalty reinforced not by threats but by hospitality. To sit at Ur-Nammu's banquet was to be reminded that abundance flowed from his hand. Disloyalty wasn't just treason, it was ingratitude. Ordinary people, too, felt the ripple. Festival feasts spilled into markets and plazas, where music played and dancers whirled. Children darted between adults, clutching sweet cakes or sticky dates. Strangers shared benches, trading gossip and laughter. In these moments, the kingdom was more than clay tablets, and Quotazit was community. One scholarly debate lingers on whether Ur-Nammu himself dined with commoners or remained apart in regal seclusion. Some depictions show kings seated publicly, raising cups before crowds. Others suggest rulers ate separately while distributing food through officials. Perhaps both happened, depending on the occasion. But the symbolism mattered. The feast came from him, whether or not he personally clinked mugs. Food, of course, carried hierarchy. Officials ate lamb, richer cuts, and finer bread, while common laborers received simpler stews and beer. Yet even those rations were better than daily fare, and the abundance mattered more than the menu. For one night, inequality was softened by the haze of drink and the comfort of full stomachs. A quirky tidbit survives from banquet imagery. Musicians often played lyres shaped like bulls, their instruments adorned with gold and lapis inlays. The sound must have been mesmerizing, low strings, humming beneath chatter. A reminder that music was as much a ration as food. Without it, the feast lacked its magic. Through rations and feasts, Ur-Nammu made generosity part of governance. People might grumble at taxes, but they remembered the festivals. Soldiers might tire of patrols, but they remembered the beer. Priests might demand more sacrifices, but they remembered the banquets where their voices joined in hymns. Politics, religion, and survival all met at the communal table. And yet, behind the abundance, there was always structure. The feasts weren't random indulgence. They were scheduled, recorded, rationed, and logged in clay. The same system that tallied barley quotas, tallied cups of beer. Ur-Nammu's genius was turning even generosity into organization. Still, food and drink don't come from thin air. Behind every banquet and ration lay the toil of farmers, shepherds, and laborers. To understand how the king could afford his feasts, we need to follow the trail backward from palace storerooms to furrowed fields, from the clink of mugs to the creak of plows. Behind the glitter of banquets and the drone of lyres stood the real foundation of Ur-Nammu's kingdom. Fields of barley swaying in hot winds, oxen dragging wooden plows, and farmers whose sweat filled the palace storehouses. Every temple feast, every soldier's ration, every worker's beer jar began with the back-breaking labor of turning soil into grain. To trace the kingdom's strength, you have to start at the plow and follow the trail all the way to the palace. Picture a farmer at dawn, his hair still damp with river water, guiding a pair of oxen yoked to a simple plow. The tool itself was little more than a wooden shaft with a pointed tip, sometimes tipped with copper, yet it carved neat furrows into the floodplain's soft soil, opening lines for barley seed. Behind him, family members followed with baskets, scattering seed by hand, their feet tamping it into place. Above, the sun rose red, and already the heat pressed down like a hand. The canals were lifelines. Without them, the fields dried into cracked earth. With them, barley could grow in abundance. Ur-Nammu's surveys and maintenance crews ensured the canals flowed steadily. But the daily work fell to farmers, clearing silt, patching embankments, opening and closing water gates with heavy wooden levers. Irrigation was less a one-time project and more a constant negotiation with water. One mainstream fact: Mesopotamian agriculture revolved around seasonal flooding, and managing that flood was the difference between bumper harvests and famine. Harvest season transformed the landscape into a hive of labor. Men cut barley stalks with sickles' curved blades set with sharp flint teeth, while women and children bundled sheaves into piles. Threshing floors buzzed with activity as donkeys or oxen trampled the stalks, freeing grain from chaff. Then came winnowing, tossing grain into the air so the breeze carried away the husks. Dust rose in golden clouds, coating every face and arm. Imagine the itch of straw in your clothes, the sore muscles, the relief of seeing sacks filling steadily. Once collected, the grain was measured and recorded. Officials arrive with clay tablets tallying quotas owed to the state. Some grain stayed with the farmers for household use, but a heavy share moved onward, loaded into reed baskets, packed onto donkeys, or stacked onto barges. The grain made its way down canals to city storehouses. There, scribes checked deliveries against quotas, stamping seals to confirm transactions. Historians still argue whether farmers felt crushed by these quotas, or whether they welcomed the predictability after years of chaos. On one hand, losing a third or more of your harvest to the state must have stung. On the other, having debts cancelled, rations distributed, and protection guaranteed, offered a stability older times lacked. The clay records don't tell us the grumbling, but it's easy to imagine muttered complaints at night while chewing barley bread. Livestock added another layer. Shepherds moved flocks across stubbled fields after harvest, their sheep fertilizing the soil while grazing. The animals provided wool, milk, and, occasionally, meat, though most were too valuable alive to slaughter casually. Like barley, sheep were tallied and taxed, their offspring counted season by season. A fringe tidbit. Some tablets record sheep delivered for weaving women, showing how temple workshops depended directly on taxed flocks. The rhythm of textile production, like that of beer brewing, began in the fields. From farms, produce flowed to temples and then to the palace. Storehouses lined with mud brick walls kept grain in massive piles, often guarded by soldiers. The smell inside was overwhelming, dusty, slightly sour, the scent of thousands of sacks stacked shoulder high. Rats no doubt skittered along the edges, though cats and traps kept them somewhat in check. Every sack represented hours of toil, but together they formed the heartbeat of the kingdom. One scholarly debate concerns whether farmers worked mostly as independent households paying tax or as state laborers on large estates. Evidence suggests a mix. Some families held plots in their own name. Others worked on land owned by temples or officials, with quotas set collectively. Either way, their barley ended up in the same place, the state's belly. And then came redistribution. Soldiers on campaign ate bread and beer made from taxed barley. Laborers hauling bricks for temples received grain rations from state stores. Priests feasted on meat from taxed flocks. Even royal banquets ultimately boiled down to the farmer's plow scratching furrows months earlier. Ur-Nammu's genius lay not in inventing this system. It had deep roots in Sumer, but in tightening it, expanding it, and branding it as the work of his just reign. To an ordinary farmer, the connection to the palace might have felt distant. You pulled weeds, cleared ditches, and cut grain while thinking mostly of survival. But every so often, the king's presence reached you. A tax collector tallying your sacks, a debt cancellation announced by decree, or a festival where you drank beer from the king's bounty. In those moments, the link between plough and palace became visible. A quirky tidbit brings a smile here. One tablet records compensation for a farmer whose ox dropped dead mid-season. Instead of punishment, he was allotted another animal, almost like an early insurance policy. Bureaucracy could be merciless, but sometimes it showed flashes of practical mercy, because without farmers, no kingdom stood. Thus, Ur-Nammu's kingdom lived in a loop. Farmers fed the palace fed the workers and soldiers. The workers built temples, and the temples blessed the farmers' fields. From plough to palace and back again, the circle spun on clay records, barley sacks, and the patient labor of countless hands. And scribes ensured that circle would not vanish into the dust. Every transaction, every ration, every law was etched in clay, tying the kingdom's memory to tablets meant to outlast generations. It was one thing to organize fields and feasts. It was another to carve order itself into eternity. Clay forgets nothing. That was Ur-Nammu's quiet triumph. Fields could wither, soldiers could desert, priests could grumble, but once something was pressed into a tablet, it had a kind of immortality. The scribes of your worked tirelessly, filling shelves with baked and unbaked clay, each tablet carrying a fragment of the king's order. To govern through laws, quotas, and rations was one thing. To preserve them for eternity was another. Ur-Nammu, ever the builder, wanted his reforms not only to shape his present, but to echo far beyond it. Scribes were the hidden engines of this permanence. Trained from boyhood, they sat cross-legged with styluses of reed, learning to press wedge after wedge into clay. Their schools, called edibas, drilled students in endless repetition. A boy might spend hours copying "A dog is in the house." A dog is not in the house until his stylus cut neat lines. Eventually, he graduated to recording taxes, contracts, and hymns. Imagine the sound of dozens of styluses scratching, the air thick with clay dust, and the muttered curses of students forced to rewrite crooked wedges. A mainstream historical fact anchors this. Thousands of tablets from the Ur-3 period survive, many stamped with the names of Ur-Nammu and his successors. They record everything from the delivery of oxen to the exact wording of law codes. Without these tablets, Ur-Nammu's reign would be little more than a rumor. With them, it becomes one of the best documented chapters in early history. His law code, in particular, shows this obsession with permanence. Written in Sumerian, it laid down principles of justice in language as clear as sun on brick. Murder and theft met harsh punishments, but most disputes resolved in silver fines, predictable, recorded, enforceable. The king wasn't just a builder of temples. He was the builder of a legal edifice, one etched into clay so that even after his body crumbled, his justice could still speak. Historians still argue whether Ur-Nammu himself dictated the code or whether scribes compiled it under his name. Perhaps he simply declared, "Bring order to the courts," and clever officials did the rest. Perhaps he sat listening as they read drafts aloud, nodding approval, tweaking lines. We will never know. But the fact that his name is stamped into the fragments shows what mattered. He became the face of justice, even if the scribes' hands shaped the words. The tablets didn't only preserve law. They carried hymns, administrative lists, even glimpses of myth. Some hymns praise Ur-Nammu as the shepherd who restored Sumer, the builder beloved of gods. Others record mundane details, rations for workers, wool allocations, shipments of fish. Together they form a chorus of voices, high and low, sacred and dull. Through them we hear not only the king, but the hum of an entire society. A fringe tidbit adds texture. Some school tablets from later centuries copied Ur-Nammu's laws as exercises. Long after his dynasty fell, students scratched his words onto practice tablets, then tossed them into heaps. Archaeologists have found these discarded fragments, the ancient equivalent of crumpled homework. It means that even when his temples cracked, and his ziggurat eroded. Ur-Nammu's voice survived in the grumbling hands of bored teenagers forced to memorize his laws. And preservation wasn't only for scribes. The bricks of temples often bore stamped inscriptions. Ur-Nammu, king of Ur, builder of the house of Nana. Each brick became a micro-tablet, carrying his name into the structure itself. To tear down a temple meant shattering thousands of bricks, all whispering his legacy. Permanence was built into the architecture, a chorus of clay chanting his kingship. One scholarly debate lingers on whether this obsession with record-keeping reflected paranoia or pride. Was Ur-Nammu genuinely concerned with justice for his people, or was he mainly worried about posterity? Did he want fairness in his courts, or did he want future generations, us, in fact, to read his name? The answer may be both. Kings rarely separated self-interest from public good. The brilliance of his system is that it achieved both simultaneously. For ordinary people, permanence meant predictability. You knew that if your grain delivery was logged on a tablet, no official could later deny it. You knew that if your marriage contract was sealed, your rights were safer than mere words. Clay gave security. It was fragile to the touch, but immortal in the archive. A quirky tidbit. Archaeologists have found envelopes of clay encasing contracts, sealed with cylinder seals. The outer shell bore the seal and summary, while inside sat the full text. To open it, you had to break the shell, leaving proof of tampering. It was a 4,000-year-old version of tamper-proof packaging, showing just how deeply scribes valued security. By making clay his ally, Ur-Nammu stretched his reach across time. Every law, every ration, every hymn became part of an archive that outlived him. In this sense, his greatest building project wasn't only the ziggurat, it was the invisible edifice of records, a kingdom preserved in baked mud. And yet, even clay has limits. A king can write himself into eternity, but he cannot write himself beyond death. Ur-Nammu, builder, lawgiver, organizer, still had to face the most universal order of all, the closing of his own life. Even a king who builds mountains of brick and laws in clay cannot escape the weight of years. Ur-Nammu's reign, though celebrated for its order, ended not in quiet old age, but in struggle. The tablets grow thinner here, the inscriptions more fragmented, but what they hint at is poignant. The Shepherd King, who had turned chaos into structure, found his last days shaped by the same violence he had worked so hard to tame. According to later chronicles, Ur-Nammu died in battle, fighting in the northern lands around modern-day Assyria. Historians still argue over the details. Was he struck down by enemy spears while leading his army? Did a campaign go disastrously wrong, leaving him abandoned on the field? Or did he simply die on campaign, his death later embroidered into legend? The certainty is gone, leaving only clay whispers. But the idea of a lawgiver falling in war has haunted scholars and poets alike, a mainstream historical fact. The Sumerian king list records that Ur-Nammu reigned for 18 years. It lists his death matter-of-factly, as if one line could contain the end of such a project. Yet hymns and laments suggest his death was felt deeply. Some fragments even hint that his people mourned him not just as a king, but as a father figure, the shepherd who had brought order back to their lives. Imagine the news reaching your soldiers trudge home, carrying stories of their fallen king. Priests light lamps in temples, chanting prayers to guide his soul. Families pause in their courtyards, whispering about the future. The ziggurat still rose. The tablets still filled storehouses, but the hand that had woven them together was gone. His burial likely matched the grandeur of his reign. Kings of yore rested in tombs beneath temples, surrounded by offerings, goods, and attendants. Archaeologists have not identified Ur-Nammu's specific tomb with certainty, but the tradition of lavish royal burials suggests he was laid to rest with care. Imagine priests sprinkling holy water, mourners chanting hymns, and clay cones pressed with curses against any who might disturb his rest. His body may have returned to dust, but his name was sealed in brick and tablet alike. Put, a fringe tidbit from later literature casts his death in mythic tones. In The Death of Ur-Nammu, a Sumerian poem, he is described as descending into the underworld, greeted not by honors but by punishment. The poem paints a strange picture. The great builder arriving in the land of the dead, stripped of power, scolded by gods, forced to face his humanity. Historians still argue whether this was a cautionary tale, a theological reflection, or simply a ritual lament. But it shows that even his memory was complex, not pure glory, but a reminder that no king escapes the leveling soil. For his dynasty, his death was both a crisis and a test. His son Shulgi succeeded him, inheriting the foundations of organization and power that his father had laid. Shulgi would go on to reign much longer, boasting of greatness, even declaring himself divine. Yet every brick Shulgi stacked, every law he enforced, traced back to the order Ur-Nammu had carved. In this sense, Ur-Nammu's legacy lived more securely in institutions than in flesh. And what of the people? To the farmer pushing a plow, the soldier on patrol, the woman weaving wool, perhaps little seemed to change. Taxes still came due, rations were still measured, festivals still brought beer. Life continued, but under the shadow of uncertainty. Would the son prove as steady as the father? Would the gods favor the kingdom again? These were questions muttered over bread and beer as families wondered what lay ahead. One quirky detail lingers in memory. Some bricks from temple repairs begun under Ur-Nammu bear inscriptions, noting that Shulgi completed what his father started. It's as if the bricks themselves grieved, whispering that their first master had left before the work was done. That continuity unfinished projects carried into the next reigns, the truest sign of his abrupt end. Thus Ur-Nammu, organizer of fields and feasts, builder of ziggurats, maker of laws, fell as all men do. His temples stood, his tablets endured, but his body joined the ancestors in the dark soil. For his people, the memory of his reign became both comfort and standard. The just king, the builder king, the shepherd who brought order. And beyond his tomb, beyond even Shulgi's long reign, echoes of Ur-Nammu carried forward. Later kings, later empires, would look back on him as the one who first wrote justice into clay and raised a city that touched the sky. His death closed a chapter, but his memory opened another one that still flickers in broken tablets dug from Mesopotamian dust. Long after Ur-Nammu's body was laid to rest, his shadow stretched across Mesopotamia. The shepherd king who had organized canals, tallied sheep, and raised temples became more than a man. He became a memory, retold, reshaped, and reused by generations who followed. Kings who ruled centuries later would still point back to him, claiming continuity with his legacy. To rule like Ur-Nammu was to rule with order, justice, and divine favor, or at least that was the image scribes etched into clay. His most enduring echo was the law code. Though fragments of it survive only in pieces, its precedent lived on. When Hammurabi of Babylon issued his far more famous stele 300 years later, he was building on a tradition Ur-Nammu had begun. The idea that justice could be written, standardized, and claimed as divine mandate. Historians still argue whether Hammurabi consciously knew of Ur-Nammu's code, but the parallels are clear. One mainstream historical fact: Hammurabi's stele even repeats the shepherd imagery Ur-Nammu loved, suggesting that later kings deliberately borrowed that symbolism. Temples, too, carried his name. The great ziggurat of yore, though repaired and rebuilt by successors, bore inscriptions crediting him as its founder. Even when the outer layers crumbled and new kings stamped their names on fresh bricks, the memory of the first builder lingered. Each restoration was a kind of conversation with the past, a silent acknowledgement that Ur-Nammu had set the foundation. A fringe tidbit comes from later Sumerian laments. Some poetic texts, recited during festivals, remembered him as both builder and tragic figure. One hymn praises his temple works, while another mourns his descent into the underworld. The duality, glory in life, pathos in death, kept his story alive as both inspiration and cautionary tale. For priests chanting these lines centuries later, Ur-Nammu was not just history, but part of their ongoing spiritual landscape. Even outside Sumer, his echoes spread. The idea of organizing through law, temple patronage, and economic redistribution rippled into later states of Mesopotamia and beyond. Kings in Assyria, Babylon, and Persia all inherited systems where the ruler was both shepherd and judge, builder and warlord. Ur-Nammu may not have invented every piece, but he crystallized them into a model others admire. Scholars debate whether his memory was deliberately cultivated by Shalgi, his son, who reigned for nearly half a century. Some suggest Shalgi exaggerated his father's greatness to strengthen his own legitimacy. Others argue Shalgi overshadowed him, painting himself as the true genius. Yet the fact remains: Shalgi's reign was built on the scaffolding Ur-Nammu had erected. The son may have sung louder, but the father had written the first notes. To ordinary people generations later, the legacy was more practical than poetic. They lived in cities whose walls traced back to his campaigns, worshipped in temples he had restored, and tilled canals first dredged under his orders. Even if they didn't speak his name daily, they lived inside the structures he left behind. His presence lingered in bricks, in boundaries, in the steady rhythm of taxes and rations. One quirky tidbit captures this endurance. Centuries after his dynasty fell, scribes in schools still copied his laws on clay as practice exercises. A bored teenager in Babylon, scratching out if a man, over and over, unknowingly preserved Ur-Nammu's voice. The echo was faint, but it carried long after ziggurats crumbled and fields changed hands. In the end, Ur-Nammu's greatest accomplishment wasn't a single temple, law, or battle. It was the weaving of all these threads into a fabric strong enough to outlast him. He took chaos and stitched it into order, binding farmers, priests, soldiers, and scribes into a system that worked. And though later empires would rise higher and fall harder, they all owed a debt to the shepherd king who first measured the land and dared to organize a kingdom. His life reminds us that power isn't only in conquest, but in structure. Not in the sword's edge, but in the quiet tally of barley. Not only in the glitter of temples, but in the consistency of law. Ur-Nammu's kingdom faded, but the idea of rule through order lived on. Even today, when archaeologists unearth a stamped brick or a clay tablet, they are still hearing his whisper across 4,000 years. And so the story drifts to silence. The king is gone, but his clay endures. The ziggurat stands in ruin, yet its shadow stretches across the plain. The shepherd rests, but the flock remembers. Now the story begins to soften, like the glow of embers fading after a long night's fire. You've walked through Ur's dusty streets, watched workers lift bricks to the heavens, and sat in feasts where beer foamed over clay mugs. You've seen Ur-Nammu build not just walls and laws, but a pattern of life where fields, temples, and people moved together like parts of a vast machine. And though his reign ended in the dust of battle, the order he created lingered like ripples on water, carrying forward into ages he would never see. As you drift, picture the ziggurat of Ur in twilight. Its broad steps glow in the last touch of sun, and shadows pool in its corners. The air is warm. The smell of baked earth still clings, and the hush of evening settles over the city. A faint breeze stirs reeds along the canals, carrying the distant laughter of children and the low bleating of sheep being herded home. Life slows, folds inward, and even the mighty city rests. Your mind can rest too. The hum of scribes, the clink of soldiers' helmets, the chants of priest soul fade now into a gentle murmur, background to the steady rhythm of your breath. Ur-Nammu has done his work. He has measured the land, counted the harvest, carved laws into clay, and left the kingdom ready for another dawn. So let the ziggurat dissolve into mist, the tablets blur into unreadable lines, the voices of the past sink into stillness. You are safe, carried by time, with a soft pulse of history around you like a lullaby. The story closes, not with noise, but with quiet.